On February 28, 1995, 20-year-old Kim Antonakis sat in front of her mirror getting ready to go out for the night in Brooklyn, New York. Kim had long, curly brown hair that matched her brown eyes, which were actually the only part of her appearance that she was never happy with. So she put on her favorite pair of gold earrings and leaned in close to the mirror to add the finishing touch, her blue contact lenses. Putting in those blue contacts made Kim feel like a different person. By day, she was a reserved college student who studied, did well in school, and worked hard at her part-time job. But by night, she was free and a bit wild, and men could not keep their eyes off of her or her blue eyes. Kim took a final look in the mirror and then walked through her ground floor apartment, a place most people her age in Brooklyn would have been jealous of. It had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and a private 2-car garage right across the street. Now, Kim alone could never have afforded this place, but luckily, her dad covered most of the rent. Kim looked over and saw her friends, April Deedley and Josh Torres, sitting on the couch watching TV. And April looked up and told Kim how pretty she looked and told Kim to go out and have a great time. April and Josh had been staying at Kim's place with their 2-year-old son for the last couple of weeks while the floors got refinished in their apartment. Kim loved getting to spend time with April and her little boy, but really, she was glad that Josh was there. Having a strong man in the apartment made her feel safer. And for most of the past month, Kim had not felt safe at all. In early January of that year, Kim had met a guy named Vladik who actually went by the nickname Psycho. He was Russian, he was very good-looking, and he was a bit older than Kim. At first, Kim thought Psycho was one of those ironic nicknames, like when a really big guy gets called Tiny or something, because Psycho seemed like a lot of fun. He was laid back and really nice when they had met, but recently, that had all changed. Kim said goodnight to April and Josh, she put her coat on, and walked outside. It was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which wasn't bad for a New York winter, but still, Kim felt a bit cold. She glanced up and down the street, looking for strange cars parked nearby or headlights coming down the road. Psycho had really begun to live up to his nickname starting about a month before, when Kim and Psycho had taken a quick trip to Florida together. Now, Kim had thought this getaway was just kind of a casual chance to go hit the beach and have some fun, but apparently Psycho saw things very differently. Because when they got back to New York, he got Kim's name tattooed on his leg, and then he proposed to her. Kim had broken things off right then. A marriage proposal was way too fast and way too serious for her, but since this breakup, Psycho had been basically stalking her. He called Kim constantly, and he came around and literally shouted at her from outside the apartment. And lately, Psycho had been showing up more and more often at her apartment because he had discovered that Kim had gotten back together with one of her ex-boyfriends, and so he was very jealous. And so Kim scanned the street one more time and saw that no one was there, and so she took a deep breath like she was trying to relax herself. Then she walked to her garage, opened up the garage door, and then slid inside of her white Honda Civic car and cranked up the stereo. She loved all kinds of music, but hip-hop was her favorite when she was going out. Kim drove about 15 blocks to pick up her friend, and as she did this, she refused to let thoughts of Psycho come into her head because that would ruin her night, and she didn't want that. And so after getting her friend, the 2 young women had a great night out. They ate dinner and then eventually ended up at a club where they danced all night until the place shut down at about 4 a.m. on March 1st. Kim drove her friend home, and even though Kim was extremely tired from being out all night, she was in a great mood. And then after dropping her friend off, a few minutes later, Kim pulled into her own garage. By this point, Kim's contacts, her blue contacts, were starting to hurt her eyes. All she wanted to do was just take them out and fall asleep in her bed. She actually had to work later that day, so she really needed to get a few hours of sleep. Kim stepped out of her car, but immediately she froze because she heard something in the darkness. She turned, but she couldn't see anything, and then she heard a noise from the other side of her garage. Terrified, Kim just clutched her keys in her hand and rushed towards the open garage door. Later that day at 4 p.m., Kim's father, Tommy Antonakis, knocked on the door of his daughter's apartment. Kim's friend, April, opened up the door, carrying her son in her arms, and she could tell right away that Tommy was upset. She asked him what was going on, and he said he hadn't heard from his daughter all day. Tommy stepped inside the apartment, and at the same time, April's boyfriend, Josh, came over to say hello, but he also could see how upset Tommy looked, and so Josh just stayed quiet and kind of waited to be told what was going on. Tommy asked April and Josh if they had any idea where Kim was, and they would tell him that they actually hadn't heard from Kim since she left the night before to go out, but they also didn't want to tell her father that this was actually pretty normal for Kim. Josh and April figured that Kim had either gone home with the guy she met or maybe stayed out super late and crashed at her friend's house. But then Tommy told them that his daughter had not shown up for work that day. Kim actually worked for her father's girlfriend, and the girlfriend had called Tommy that day to let him know she was not in. At this, April and Josh both got very concerned looks on their faces. As much as Kim liked to go out and party and have a good time, she was also very responsible when it came to school and work. She would never just not show up for work without calling. And on top of that, Kim did have a cell phone, which still wasn't very common at this time, but she hadn't answered any of her father's calls. And so Josh asked if maybe Kim had tried calling Tommy at his house. But Tommy said he'd only missed one call on his home phone that day, and when he checked the message on his answering machine, it was just static, so he had no idea if, that was his daughter or not. And so Josh asked Tommy if he wanted to go down to the garage to see if Kim's car was there. Tommy agreed this was a good idea, so the two men made their way out of the apartment and across the street and opened the garage door. But Kim's white Honda Civic was not inside. Now, both men didn't know how to react to this. However, Josh kind of threw out there that, hey, this could be a good thing. This might mean Kim is actually still with her friend. But now Josh also looked as worried as Tommy. A few minutes later, Tommy left the garage and the apartment and went straight to the nearest police station. And when he got there, two officers listened to his story, but they told him that even though of course he was concerned, that realistically, an adult woman who hadn't even been gone for 24 hours at this point did not warrant a missing persons report, at least not yet. But Tommy begged them to please at least go to his daughter's apartment to see if maybe they could find anything out of the ordinary. And now at this point, Tommy was so distraught that the officers were actually worried that he might have a total mental breakdown right there in the station. And so they told him, okay, we'll swing by your daughter's apartment and have a quick look around. And so a little later that afternoon, Tommy stood outside of Kim's garage while the officers searched inside the garage. And at some point, one of the officers knelt down and waved his partner over because he had found a gold earring laying on the ground. And when Tommy heard this, he lost it. He said this had to be proof something bad happened to his daughter. The officers tried to calm him down, telling him, hey, her earring could have just fallen out when she got into the car. That's not totally out of the realm of possibility. But they did tell Tommy they would now issue a search for her vehicle and let him know if they found anything. Tommy then gave the officers a photo of Kim and said she had two distinct tattoos that people might have noticed, depending on how she was dressed. There was a scorpion on her left thigh and an infinity symbol on her lower back. The cops said they'd keep Tommy informed and then headed out. Tommy immediately went back to Kim's apartment, and when he got inside, he said to April and Josh that he knew something was wrong here and he didn't think the police were taking him seriously. And so he asked Josh if he would help him put up missing person flyers with Kim's picture all around the city, and Josh said, yeah, whatever you need, I'll help you. And so while the two men laid out their plan for these missing person flyers, April contacted the friend that Kim had gone out with the night before. And the friend said that, her and Kim had stayed at the club until around 4 a.m. when it closed, and then afterward, Kim had dropped her off, and that was the last the friend had seen Kim. And so after April relayed this information to Tommy, Tommy became convinced that this, in conjunction with the earring that was found in the garage, meant something must have happened to Kim in the garage right when she got home after dropping off her friend. And so Tommy looked at Josh, totally despondent, and said they were already running out of time if they wanted to find Kim alive. On March 3rd, so 2 days after Kim had gone missing, Kim's mother arrived in town. Over the last 2 days, her ex-husband, Tommy, had continued to put up flyers all around the city, and the police had really ramped up their search for Kim and her car, but nobody had any idea where Kim was. So that's why Kim's mom had come to New York to conduct a search for her daughter in her own way. Kim's mother walked through a small row house in the Bay Bridge neighborhood of Brooklyn, and the house was dark and smelled of incense and candles. She stepped through a curtain at the back of the house and entered a room where a woman with long dark hair sat at a small wooden table. This was the psychic Kim's mother had come to see. The psychic told Kim's mom to take a seat and then asked her how could she help. Kim's mom fought back tears and said her daughter had not been seen in days. She put a photo of Kim and a few of Kim's personal belongings on the table, then she pulled out a small tape recorder from her purse and asked the psychic if she could record this session. The psychic nodded and then touched the objects that belonged to Kim. Then the psychic closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a minute, the only sound in the room was the hypnotic click of the spinning tape in the tape recorder. Then the psychic opened her eyes and began talking. She said to Kim's mother that Kim was alive, but she was no longer in Brooklyn. She was tied up in some place cold and dark, maybe a basement. Then the psychic looked up like she was trying to see something in the room that was invisible to everybody else, and she told Kim's mom that different letters had begun to appear in front of her, and one of them was a big letter T. A moment later, the psychic sort of came out of her trance, and at this point, Kim's mom hit stop on the tape recorder. Later that day, Kim's mom met with April, Josh, and Kim's ex-boyfriend, Jay Negron, at Kim's apartment. Kim's mom knew that her daughter had started sleeping with Jay again, even though Kim didn't really like him. Kim's mom didn't think this was a good idea, but she was happy to see that Jay was there and willing to help. Kim's mom took out her tape recorder and said she had come from a meeting with a psychic. Jay stifled a laugh and glanced over at Josh and April, but they looked like they were taking this very seriously. The recording started, and Jay quickly stopped smirking. The psychic's voice on the recording sounded eerie, like it was coming from someplace far away. And when the psychic got to the part about seeing the letters in the room floating around, everybody got a deadly serious look on their face. April didn't want to say anything in front of Kim's mom, but she thought the letter T that the psychic saw clearly pointed to a particular person, Kim's father, Tommy, T for Tommy. At 2 a.m. on March 4th, 3 days after Kim had gone missing, a man woke up at his house in Queens, New York, about 30 minutes from Kim's apartment. The man smelled smoke, so he rushed out of his bedroom, but he quickly realized the smoke was not coming from inside of his house. So the man ran outside and looked down the street, and flames engulfed an old wooden 2-story house down the block, and smoke was pouring out of the windows. The man ran back inside and called 911, and he would tell the operator that the house that was on fire had been abandoned for a long time, but there could be squatters inside, so it was possible there were people in immediate danger right now. So the operator said they would send fire and rescue right away. Soon after that, fire trucks roared down the street with their sirens wailing, and they arrived in front of the abandoned burning house. Firefighters got right to work, and luckily, once they got inside, they could tell the house did seem to be empty, and they were able to put out the flames quickly. But then several firefighters walked through the now smoldering house to try to discover what the source of the fire had been. And one of them led the way down the stairs into the basement of this building, and he quickly told the others to stay back. He had seen some terrible things on this job, but what he saw in the basement was the worst he had ever seen. The others called down to him and asked if he was okay, and he just turned and shouted up that they needed to get the police down here right away. Later that morning, detectives Louis Pia and Tom Shelvin of the NYPD arrived at the burned-out building in Queens. Other cops thought that Pia and Shelvin made the perfect team. Pia could talk to anyone and seemed like their best friend right away, or maybe their favorite uncle. He was known on the force for getting guilty people to quickly confess to their crimes, because they suddenly just wanted to do the right thing and not let Pia down. On the other hand, Shelvin was quiet and methodical. Other cops said when he analyzed evidence at a scene, it was like he could transport himself to the moment of the crime and see exactly what had happened. Pia and Shelvin could still smell smoke as they walked through the burned-out house. They descended the stairs and stepped into the basement. And just like the firefighter, these two experienced New York homicide detectives could not believe what they were looking at. In the basement, slumped over in a burned-out chair, they saw an obvious corpse that was charred from the waist up. This person's clothes and their facial features had been completely and utterly burned off. The detectives walked closer to the body, and they were able to identify that the victim was almost certainly a woman, and she still had pieces of burned duct tape on her wrists that had been used to bind her hands behind her back. Detective Pia stared at the body. He knew it was not much of a consolation, but he said he hoped this poor woman was already dead by the time her body was on fire. Detective Shelvin crouched down to get a better look at the body, and as he did, he leaned in close, and he saw something on her left thigh that caught his attention. He shouted to Pia, and Pia also crouched down next to him. Through the very badly burned skin on this woman's leg, the detective saw a scorpion tattoo. The two detectives walked around the chair, which had actually mostly survived the blaze, intact, and they looked at the woman's back. Most of the skin was completely charred, but a small piece of skin on her lower back was not as badly burned as the rest of her. And that's where the detectives saw the infinity tattoo. Pia called into the station and was quickly put in touch with an officer who had been working a missing persons case in nearby Brooklyn. And the officer said those two tattoos that were found on the victim inside the basement matched the description of a young woman who'd been missing for a few days in the area. Pia knew he would need to get dental records to actually confirm everything, but he knew deep down they had just discovered the body of Kim Antonakis. The following day, detectives Pia and Shelvin met with April and Josh at their own apartment. The couple had moved out of Kim's apartment so her mother could stay there, and so now Josh and April, who were very shaken up, took turns speaking to the police about what happened to their friend, while the other parent would stay with the son. Pia and Shelvin wanted to know about any close relationships Kim had, particularly romantic or sexual relationships. Something about the horror and brutality at the crime scene had made the detectives think that maybe an angry or jealous boyfriend was the most likely culprit. April and Josh, who again were kind of shell-shocked by everything that had happened, basically said the same thing to police, that Kim had begun seeing her ex-boyfriend Jay again, but honestly that did not seem very serious. However, there was one person they felt like the cops needed to speak to right away, and that was Kim's other ex-boyfriend, whose nickname was Psycho. Now, the detectives couldn't believe this guy actually referred to himself as Psycho. It was like advertising yourself as a violent criminal. But then, after talking to April and Josh about how psychotic Psycho really had been, after stalking Kim and being totally maniacal after she had broken up with him, well, the detectives were pretty sure they had the perfect suspect who, maybe his nickname was right on brand. And it didn't take them long to discover that Psycho had ties to the Russian mob in New York, and that he was out on bail from a statutory rape charge, and that he had a history of physically assaulting people who made him angry. So later that day, the detectives tracked down Psycho and called him into the station for questioning. Psycho walked into the interview room with a level of confidence the detectives weren't used to seeing in suspects. Psycho was tall, pale, blonde, had blue eyes and a light beard, and when he sat down across from the two detectives, he grinned and actually laughed before either of the detectives had asked him anything. Detective Pia told Psycho that Kim Antonakis had been murdered, and after that, Psycho just stared at Pia, completely calm and unaffected. And so Pia eventually broke the silence by asking Psycho how he knew Kim, and at this, Psycho smiled and laughed again. And then he said, the name Kim rings a bell, but I can't really picture her. Pia smiled right back at Psycho and asked, hey, if you don't know who Kim is, then why do you have her name tattooed on your leg? Psycho leaned back in his chair and got a look on his face like this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. He said he did have the letters K-I-M tattooed on his leg, but it wasn't for this girl Kim. It stood for something that wouldn't make sense to these detectives. It was just a positive phrase that inspired him. The detectives looked at each other, and they almost started laughing. Psycho's act would be entertaining if he wasn't a murder suspect, so Pia leaned in and told Psycho to stop lying. The police knew Psycho had been coming around Kim's apartment after she broke up with him, and also several people had told the detectives that they had seen Psycho physically on Kim's block the day she disappeared. At this, Psycho lowered his eyes and dropped the tough guy act. He admitted to not only knowing Kim, but also dating her at one point, but he still insisted his tattoo had nothing to do with her and that their relationship wasn't actually all that serious. And then he told the detectives that he really had nothing to do with her death. By the end of the interview, despite Psycho seeming like a totally psychotic and very likely suspect, the detectives did not have enough information to actually hold Psycho, so they let him go. However, based on his criminal record and his connection to the victim, they were able to secure a warrant to conduct surveillance on him. The detectives hoped that surveillance would pay off quickly, but in the meantime, they decided to move on to another one of Kim's ex-boyfriends, Jay. A few days after Kim's murder, the detectives met with Jay at the station, and they had a much easier conversation than they'd had with Psycho. Jay told them that he and Kim had been dating for a while, and even though they split up for a time, they had been back together at the time that Kim disappeared and was ultimately killed. The detectives both took note of this. April and Josh had made it sound like Kim was sort of back with Jay, but it wasn't serious. They were just sleeping together, and so maybe this upset Jay. Maybe he wanted more from her. Maybe he did want to be fully back together, and, when Kim didn't want that, maybe he got angry and kidnapped and killed her in a rage. But the detectives didn't let on what they were thinking. Instead, they just let Jay keep on talking. And eventually, Jay would say that there was actually someone the cops needed to look into. At this, Pia raised his hand to stop Jay and said, yep, they'd already spoken to Psycho, but Jay shook his head. He wasn't talking about Psycho. The cops needed to investigate Kim's own father, Tommy. The detectives looked at each other surprised. Tommy had rushed to the police first, and he had been trying to find his daughter even before the NYPD launched a full-scale search, and Tommy, by all accounts, had been devastated the second he found out his daughter could be in trouble. So Pia asked Jay why on earth would he think Tommy had anything to do with what happened to his daughter. Now, Jay did not want to say the real reason that a psychic had told Kim's mother about seeing a letter T floating in the air, because he figured the detectives would laugh in his face if that was his reason for suspecting Tommy. And so instead, Jay lowered his voice, like he was afraid somebody could be listening to him, and he told the detectives that he was pretty sure Kim's father, Tommy, had connections to the mafia. This seemed completely out of left field to the detectives, but Jay said he knew the family pretty well, and he really was not making this up. All they needed to do to confirm this was just look into Tommy's businesses. The detectives chatted with Jay for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped up the interview and thanked Jay for coming in and sent him home. After he was gone, the detectives struggled with what they had to do next. The idea of interrogating a father who had just lost his daughter in such a violent, horrific way made both detectives feel sick. But unless the cops surveilling Psycho found something basically right now, they had to keep digging if they were going to find out what happened to Kim. And so later that day, Pia and Shelvin drove to Tommy's house, and Tommy came to the door and welcomed them inside, but he looked horrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He was jittery, and he struggled to even put full sentences together. And then Pia told Tommy they were actually there to question him. And at this, Tommy lost it. He screamed that they were just wasting their time while his daughter's killer clearly was out there roaming the streets. And if they knew how to do their jobs, they would not be questioning him about the murder of his beloved daughter, the person who meant more to him than anybody else in the world. Pia told Tommy that it really was just routine for police to follow up with everyone who was close to the victim. And Tommy at this, managed to calm down a bit, but he was still very upset about this. And so Pia just got right to the point and asked if Tommy had any connections to the mafia. Tommy shook his head. He couldn't believe where this investigation was going. He said they could look into his businesses or whatever they wanted, and they wouldn't find any links to organized crime. He said, yes, he did happen to have an office near the office of famous New York mobster John Gotti, and he had met some of Gotti's people in passing a couple of times, but that was it. There was no actual connection to the mafia. And then Tommy just began shouting for the detectives to do some real work and go find his daughter's killer. The detectives could tell Tommy was not willing to talk to them right now, so they quickly left the house and just headed back to the station. As a father, Pia knew how gut-wrenching it must be for Tommy to hear someone even suggest he might have done something to hurt his own child. But as the detectives dug into Tommy's potential ties to the mafia, something did jump out at them. Tommy owned several businesses, and one of them was a fire insurance company. Detective Shelvin said that, regardless of whether Tommy had mafia connections or not, as someone who dealt with fire insurance professionally, he would likely know how to burn a house down and leave nothing traceable behind. And if the guy in Queens hadn't smelled smoke and woken up when he did, there was a chance firefighters would have not stopped the blaze before it basically totally consumed Kim's body. Pia hated to even consider this theory, and he still hoped it was just a matter of time before Psycho or somebody else made a mistake and proved that Tommy had not murdered his own daughter. But as the days went by, police didn't seem to be getting closer to pinning down Psycho or anyone else. The case was just wide open. Police did, however, finally locate Kim's abandoned car miles away from her apartment, but it had been completely wiped down, so there were no prints to point the detectives in the right direction. And so soon, months went by with no new leads, and Pia and Shelvin felt like they were running out of ideas. So they engaged in what they called, quote, shoe leather work, end quote, literally walking the streets around Kim's apartment and the house in Queens where she had been found, knocking on doors and talking to anybody they could. It felt like a very thankless job. But then, in June of 1995, so 3 months after Kim's murder, the detectives got a call from a police officer in the Queens neighborhood they'd been walking around in, and they would tell the detectives that another body had turned up. And this body was a young man who had been murdered in the street, literally, mafia execution style. Pia and Shelvin got the victim's details and then sped to his house in Queens. When they got there, the victim's mother let them in and said they could look around to see if they could find anything that would help their case. She told them that she had no idea who had killed her son. However, she did tell them her son had begun hanging around what she considered to be a bad crowd. Pia sat and spoke to the very upset mother some more while Shelvin searched the house. And at some point, Shelvin got to a room at the back of the house and he looked out the window, and just over the fence, he could see the backyard of the abandoned house where Kim's body had been found. Shelvin walked back through the house and asked the mother if she'd ever seen anybody going in or out of that abandoned home, or if she knew if her son had ever gone in there for any reason. And the woman said, she hadn't seen anybody go in there for well over a month and really couldn't imagine why her son would have gone inside either. The detectives thanked her for her time, and then they headed back to their car. And once they got in there, they both agreed there was just no way this could be a big coincidence, that this young man who had been murdered mafia style just happened to live right behind the abandoned house where Kim had been murdered. And with all this talk about the mafia connection to Kim's murder, it just felt like this young man's murder had to be connected to Kim's in some way. They just didn't know what that way was. On September 3rd, 1995, so 6 months after Kim's murder, Detectives Pia and Shelvin sat at their desks and went over their notes like they had been doing almost every day since the murder. They had found a possible connection between Kim and that young man who was the shooting victim in Queens, but nothing concrete had come out of that yet. On top of that, Psycho, despite being under surveillance, had not shown his hand in any way, and also the detectives had discovered that Kim's father, Tommy, really had absolutely no discernible ties to the mafia. So at this point, none of their leads had panned out. However, the detectives refused to say that Kim's case had gone cold, but they admitted it was, at the very least, lukewarm. But just then, the detectives heard shouting and crying down the hall. They looked up and saw an officer leading a blonde woman towards them. The officer had an apologetic look on his face, and he said, this woman claimed to have vital information regarding Kim's murder, and she kind of barged her way down here. Now, a lot of people had made similar claims over the past several months, so Pia and Shelvin understood why this officer was hesitant to let this woman come down and talk to them right away, but they stood up and they could see how upset this woman was. Also, it looked like she had some serious bruising on her cheeks and around her eyes. So the detectives walked over to the woman and wanted to make sure she didn't need immediate medical attention, but the woman shook them off and said she needed cops, not doctors. Pia nodded and said, "Okay, well, what's your name?" And she smiled through tears and pointed to her hair and said everyone just called her Blondie. Pia smiled back at her and asked her to tell him and his partner, what's going on here. Blondie took a deep breath and stopped crying. She said that morning, she and her boyfriend had gotten into an argument. Blondie said she was sure he was cheating on her. And so she got very upset and angry and began yelling at him, but instead of just yelling back at her, her boyfriend grabbed a shovel and hit her with it. Blondie fell to the floor and thought her boyfriend was going to literally kill her, but he ended up just running outside, stealing her motorcycle, and speeding off. Pia told Blondie, I'm so sorry, and then told her she really ought to go get some medical attention, but then he also asked her, what does this have to do with Kim's murder? Blondie glanced between Pia and Shelvin and took a deep breath, and then she said, while she was on the floor after being struck by the shovel and thinking she was about to be killed, her boyfriend, before running off, leaned down, got into her face, and told her he had already set one woman on fire and he would have no problem doing it again. The detectives asked Blondie who her boyfriend was, and when she gave them the name, they knew he had been telling Blondie the truth about previously burning someone because they knew her boyfriend had to be Kim's murderer. Based on the information Blondie provided, interviews, and evidence found at the crime scene, the following is a reconstruction of what the detectives believe happened to Kim Antonakis beginning in the early morning of March 1st, 1995. On March 1st, at about 4 a.m., the kidnappers sat crouched behind a parked car a few feet away from Kim's garage. It was getting colder outside, and the kidnappers were tired of waiting. Finally, they saw a white Honda Civic coming down the street, and they knew it had to be Kim's. And so the kidnappers stood up, and after confirming it was hers, they ducked back down. They were wearing all black clothes, gloves, and face masks, so they remained hidden in the darkness. From their crouched position, they watched as Kim's car pulled into the garage, and they waited right outside. Once the overhead light inside of the garage went out, each of the kidnappers crept inside and crouched down on opposite sides of Kim's car. The hip-hop music from inside the car cut out, and then Kim turned off the engine. At this point, the kidnappers were totally still, fixated on the driver's side door. The door opened and Kim stepped out, but immediately she stopped, because when she looked to one side of the garage and then the other, she saw something moving around, she heard something, it scared her, and so she began rushing towards the open garage door. At this point, one of the kidnappers leapt out of the darkness and surprised Kim from behind. They wrapped their arms around her, but Kim screamed and thrashed with her elbows and almost broke free. She scraped her long fingernails down the kidnapper's arm and thrust her keys at the kidnapper's face. And finally, the kidnapper's grip loosened and Kim got away. Kim made a break for it, but at this point, the other kidnapper leapt at her and brought her to the ground. It was at this point one of her earrings fell out and landed on the ground. Kim kept on fighting, but the kidnapper now had her pinned, and then suddenly Kim's head slammed against the ground, completely stunning her. The kidnapper on top of Kim turned her over onto her stomach and pulled her arms behind her back. At this point, the other one rushed over and unrolled a strip of duct tape and bound Kim's hands behind her back. Then both kidnappers flipped her back over. Kim would have felt a piece of duct tape being stretched across her mouth, and then would have felt her head slam against the ground one more time, at which point she lost consciousness. The kidnappers lifted Kim up and threw her in the trunk of her own car, and then sped down the street in her car and drove from Brooklyn to Queens. They made their way to that abandoned house and parked right out front. The street was pitch black and nobody was out that early in the morning. So the kidnappers just pulled Kim out of the trunk and dragged her right into the abandoned house and down the steps into the basement. Once in the basement, Kim began regaining consciousness and she screamed through the tape, but the kidnappers threw her onto a chair, crouched down, taped her feet, and then walked out of the basement, locking the door behind them. Kim would remain in that basement for about 36 hours without food or water, just sitting in that chair all tied up until the cold sent her into the final stages of hypothermia. She drifted in and out of consciousness and started hallucinating, so she could never really tell if she was alone or if people were there with her. Then, in the early morning of March 4th, 3 days after Kim was kidnapped, the basement door flew open again. Kim's kidnappers remained at the top of the stairs, but Kim's killers walked down the steps into the basement, and one of them held a gas can. The killer with the gas can walked right up to Kim, and from the looks of it, Kim seemed dead. But the killer didn't care. The killer leaned down, kissed Kim on the forehead, and said, quote, "Shit happens and life sucks," end quote. But the truth was, Kim was not dead. Hypothermia had simply slowed down multiple functions of her body, so she appeared dead, but certainly was not. Which means Kim was fully alive when the killer doused her with gasoline, took several steps back, lit a match, and flung it at her, setting her on fire. Once the fire started, the killers and the kidnappers turned and fled the scene and watched from outside as the house went up in flames. Then the killer and the kidnappers got in 2 separate cars and drove away. Eventually, the killers made it back to Brooklyn and they split up. One just kind of walked the streets for a while the other went back to their apartment and checked in on their 2-year-old son before they went to bed. It would turn out the man who called himself Psycho, that police really believed must have had something to do with Kim's murder, had nothing to do with it. And as for Kim's father, Tommy, he loved his daughter more than he loved anyone, and he would never have done anything to hurt her, just like he said. The truth was, Kim's horrific murder had taken place simply because somebody wanted a new car. Josh Torres, the man who'd been staying at Kim's apartment with his girlfriend April and their 2-year-old son, really liked Kim's white Honda Civic. And he started thinking that he really wanted a car just like that, or one maybe even nicer. And Josh's good friend, Jay, just happened to be Kim's ex-boyfriend, and he knew firsthand that Kim's dad was rich and could easily hand over enough money for Josh to get whatever car he wanted. And Jay was willing to help Josh pull this off because deep down, Jay knew that Kim did not really love him the way he loved her, and so he knew this relationship was never really going to amount to much. And also, Jay figured he wasn't really ripping Kim off, he was just ripping off her rich dad, who could easily afford giving up some money. And so Josh came up with a plan to kidnap Kim and get ransom money from her dad. And he reached out to 2 friends to pull off the kidnapping job, and one of them lived near an abandoned house that he said would be the perfect place to stash Kim until her dad forked over the ransom money. Jay, who knew Kim's schedule really well, helped the other guys, the kidnappers, work out the details of the plan and pick the perfect time to put it in motion. And in the early morning of March 4th, when Kim was kidnapped, everything seemed to be going the way it was supposed to. But later that day, things began to fall apart. After the kidnapping, Josh called Kim's father, Tommy, and played him a pre-recorded ransom demand, telling Tommy to leave $75,000 at a specific location at a specific time. But Tommy's answering machine did not pick up the recorded message. Instead, it just sounded like static, and Tommy had no idea that message had anything to do with his daughter. And when Tommy showed up at the apartment asking Josh for help, Josh panicked. So he did everything he could to make it look like he was desperately trying to find Kim, while he and Jay secretly figured out a different way to get Tommy the ransom message. But then everything changed again when Kim's mother came to town and visited the psychic and played that recording for Josh and Jay. because the psychic correctly said Kim was no longer in Brooklyn and that she was in a cold, dark basement. But more importantly, the psychic did not just mention the letter T floating around, she also said that she kept seeing one other letter, the letter J. And when Josh and Jay heard that, they freaked out because their names begin with J. And so, totally convinced the psychic knew exactly what was happening, Josh and Jay went to that abandoned house where Kim was with the two guys they had hired to kidnap Kim. Josh had picked up a gas can on the way over, claiming they would just move Kim to a different location and then burn the abandoned house down, kind of destroying evidence. But investigators would never know if that was actually Josh's intention. Because when Josh saw Kim in the basement and thought she was dead, even though she wasn't, she was just hypothermic, Josh would say he felt like the only way to deal with the situation was to light her on fire and burn her body along with the house, destroying all evidence. But of course, Kim was actually alive. Detectives Pia and Shelvin had actually begun to suspect Josh and Jay when that dead young man turned up in Queens, the guy who was shot out in the street, mafia execution style. That young man, who would turn out to be one of Kim's kidnappers, had connections to both Josh and Jay. But it was ultimately Blondie, the woman who had been attacked by her boyfriend, who broke the case wide open. Because Blondie's boyfriend at the time was Josh. Not long after Kim's murder, he had left April and their kid and started seeing Blondie. Police arrested both Josh and Jay, and Detective Pia very quickly got Jay to tell him absolutely everything that had happened. In fact, Jay cut a deal with the prosecution and would only serve 2 years in prison. As for Josh, he was not found guilty of the execution-style murder in Queens of that young man. However, he was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Kim and was sentenced to 58 years to life in prison. In Akron, Ohio, June is typically the gloomiest and wettest month of the year. But on one particular morning in June of 2001, when Akron resident Jeff Zack poked his head out of his bedroom window, he was thrilled to discover that the sun was out and the sky was clear. Jeff immediately rushed to his closet to change into his yard work clothes. He pulled on a t-shirt and then he zipped up a pair of beat-up old cargo shorts, and then he raced down the stairs, grabbed his pruning shears, and then dashed out the back door without even putting his shoes on. On the stoop behind his house, the 44-year-old gardening enthusiast / professional landscaper paused briefly to admire his work. Although Jeff's backyard was a pretty standard size and shape for an American house in the suburbs, it was filled with lush green grass that was always perfectly cut, and around the perimeter of the yard, Jeff had planted the colorful rose bushes that were just about to reach their peak bloom. After stepping down the few back steps, Jeff began marching across his beautiful grass toward his rose bushes to do some pruning. As he walked along, he smiled to himself, feeling certain he must have the best landscaping in the whole neighborhood. Jeff was a very competitive guy, and so he loved being the best at things. But as much as he'd love to say that he had some kind of magical touch with plants, the truth was, Jeff just understood how plants worked. Give them the right mixture of sunlight, soil, and water, and plants will reward you with fruit and flowers. Simple. But as Jeff lifted his pruning shears to make the first cut, he heard his wife Bonnie calling to him from the kitchen about breakfast being ready, and he was instantly reminded that people were not like plants. People were complicated. You could give them everything they ever thought they wanted, and still they'd be miserable. And as Jeff cut back the errant stems of his rose bush, he thought about how his relationship with Bonnie was a perfect example of this. Jeff and Bonnie had gotten married 15 years ago. At the time, they wanted the same things in life, stability and family, and they were both very physically attracted to each other. So, logically speaking, their marriage should have worked out perfectly. But it didn't, at least not to Jeff. Even though Bonnie had given Jeff the family and the stability he'd always wanted, and she still was very attractive to him, there were still times when Jeff just could not stand to look at her. And sometimes just the sound of her voice, even when she was doing something nice, like that morning calling out to him to let him know that she had made him breakfast, was like nails on a chalkboard for Jeff. And not because Bonnie was a bad person or bad wife. Really, it was the opposite. She was a great wife who'd given him everything he thought he wanted, but still Jeff just felt unhappy. And unfortunately, his unhappiness had led to bitter resentment of his wife. However, recently, Jeff had begun telling himself that it was him who needed to make changes, not his wife. And so, over the last month, Jeff had been making a very conscious effort to be kinder, more patient, and less hot-headed when he was around his wife and also his son. But every day was a struggle. After cutting one more stem on his rosebush, Jeff stood up and walked back over to the door leading into the house. He paused just outside of it and took a few deep breaths to calm down. He knew he felt annoyed with his wife for really no other reason than he heard her voice, but he told himself today he would do his best to be a better husband and a better father. Jeff wiped his feet on the mat and then he opened the door and stepped inside. Less than an hour later, Jeff had fallen back into his old angry ways and was screaming at his wife Bonnie for no apparent reason and saying he wanted a divorce. Moments later, Jeff was storming outside, slamming the front door behind him. Once outside, Jeff clambered into his Ford Explorer SUV parked in the driveway, and after firing the engine up, he flew out of the driveway and just started driving. For the next couple of hours, Jeff drove around the city aimlessly, honking and yelling at other drivers, and just kind of generally taking out his anger on anyone who happened to come near him. But at a certain point during this kind of crazed drive around town, Jeff realized he actually had a lot of errands he needed to run, so he decided he would start doing those. Jeff usually had a lot of errands to run because he worked in a lot of different businesses. In addition to professionally landscaping, Jeff also worked as a handyman, he did some flooring work, and he also owned and operated a slew of vending machines around town. As Jeff was getting ready to head to a hardware store for his first errand, he looked down and he realized he was very low on gas. So instead of going to the hardware store, Jeff decided he would go to BJ's. BJ's is a big American wholesale store, and it's where Jeff went every Saturday to buy items for his various vending machines. BJ's also had their own gas station right out front near the parking lot, so Jeff figured he could get the gas he needed for his car and then also knock out a vending machine refill run. When Jeff arrived out front of BJ's and looked at the parking lot and the gas station, he was immediately struck by how crowded the place seemed. Now, BJ's is a very popular store, and the parking lot is usually full of people, but this day it just seemed like there were way more people than usual. But when Jeff looked at his watch and saw the date, he knew why. It was Saturday, June 16th, the day before Father's Day, and so most likely, all these people were here getting all the things they would need for their celebration the next day. Things like hot dogs and hamburgers, chips, soda, lawn chairs, charcoal for grills. Father's Day is a big cookout day in the US. And as Jeff thought about Father's Day, his heart sunk. What a terrible father and husband he had been that morning, yelling at his wife and slamming the door on the way out. Suddenly, all Jeff wanted to do was rush home, say he was sorry, and give his wife and son a big hug. So he whipped his Ford Explorer into the gas station right up alongside an open pump, and as quick as he could, he got to work getting the nozzle into his car to start filling up. There were so many vehicles moving in and out of the gas station that Jeff didn't even notice the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet pull up right behind him. After filling his car's tank and then putting the pump back in the holster, Jeff climbed back inside of his car. And there, sitting behind the wheel, Jeff glanced over at all the happy families buzzing around the BJ's parking lot, loading their Father's Day celebration goods into their cars, and as he watched, Jeff felt another pang of regret about how he had acted that morning. Luckily, he'd be home soon, he could apologize, and maybe even salvage a fun Father's Day the next day. But before Jeff could fire up his car's engine, the motorcyclist in the full-faced helmet that had pulled up behind Jeff walked up to Jeff's driver's side window. Jeff noticed him and looked up at him through his window very inquisitively, and as he did this, the motorcyclist casually raised a .38 caliber handgun from his waist, he aimed it at the glass, and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. Jeff's head fell forward onto the car's horn. And suddenly, between the sound of the gunshot and the sound of Jeff's car horn, which was now just blaring constantly, everyone at the gas station and in the nearby BJ's parking lot was thrown into a sudden panic. That is, everyone except for the motorcyclist who had just shot Jeff. While everyone else was screaming and running around and trying to figure out what was going on, the motorcyclist simply turned around, walked calmly back to their bike, and then rode away from the scene as if nothing happened. One of the people who actually saw the shooting take place was the gas station attendant, and within 30 seconds of the shooting, this attendant was on the phone with 911. But by that point, it was already too late for Jeff. He was dead. Jeff had been murdered in front of dozens of people in one of the most crowded shopping centers in the city, and yet, when police arrived just a few minutes after the 911 call, they would discover that not a single witness could actually identify the shooter. In fact, nobody could even say for sure if the shooter was a man or a woman. All that anyone could remember was that the motorcyclist had been wearing a full-faced helmet and that they were riding a green and white Ninja motorcycle. Given the cold-blooded nature of the murder and the fact that it was done in broad daylight in public, the police knew it was only a matter of time before the news of what happened found its way to the victim's family, Jeff's family. To ensure that that was not how the family learned about Jeff's death, not long after arriving on scene and identifying Jeff, police officers radioed back to the station to tell the chief that someone needed to go to Jeff's house ASAP to break the news. 15 minutes later, a pair of detectives arrived in front of Jeff's perfectly landscaped two-story home. And when Jeff's wife, Bonnie, opened the door, the police were apologetic but direct. They told the 46-year-old woman what happened to her husband and asked if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt him. Bonnie leaned against the doorframe as if it was the only thing holding her up. It was clear that Bonnie was shocked by the news of her husband's death, but as Bonnie would tell the detectives, she was not exactly surprised by it. For one thing, Bonnie said, Jeff had a lot of enemies. In fact, Jeff seemed to make enemies wherever he went. He was an aggressive and deeply unhappy person who seemed to enjoy being confrontational. So, as far as Bonnie was concerned, it was definitely possible that Jeff had been killed by someone he had upset. But Bonnie was quick to tell police that she did not think her husband had been killed by a total stranger. Before saying another word, Bonnie scanned the street out front and then invited the detectives to come inside her house where she could explain why she thought this was no random attack. The detectives followed Bonnie into her kitchen, and once they were all seated around the table, Bonnie told them that she believed her husband knew he was going to be killed. She said about a month earlier, Jeff had started acting different. Bonnie admitted that for years, Jeff had been emotionally and physically abusive with her. He also cheated on her constantly, and sometimes, as recently as that morning, he threatened to divorce her. But lately, Bonnie told them, he'd been generally kinder to her, all things considered, which was very noticeable, and he had also begun saying strange things to her that seemed to indicate that he thought he was going to die soon. Bonnie said that 3 weeks earlier, Jeff had taken her down into their basement to show her where he kept his financial papers. Bonnie asked him why he was showing this to her now, all of a sudden, after 15 years of marriage, and Jeff just said it was because he wanted her to know where to find things in case he wasn't around to provide for them. Bonnie thought this was totally ridiculous because her husband seemed totally healthy, and so she didn't think much of it. However, Bonnie told the detectives that just a few days ago, someone had called their house and left a voicemail for Jeff. It was a man who just kept demanding to speak with Jeff, and his tone very obviously suggested he was not happy with Jeff. Bonnie had saved the voicemail and wound up playing it right there in the kitchen for the detectives. And after the short message was over, they agreed that whoever was calling sounded very threatening. Bonnie told detectives that when Jeff came home on the night that this voicemail came through, she immediately played it for Jeff and then asked him who was that. Bonnie would tell detectives that as Jeff listened to this recording, he looked visibly frightened by whoever was on the phone. But he would say to Bonnie that he didn't know who it was or what they wanted, and that Bonnie should just forget about it and move on. But Bonnie could tell her husband was lying. It seemed obvious to her that Jeff knew who this guy was, he knew what he wanted, and he just didn't want to tell her. This information was obviously very interesting to the detectives, but the most interesting thing they would hear while visiting Jeff's house was not this recording or anything Bonnie said. Instead, it was something Jeff and Bonnie's 12-year-old son said. While Bonnie and the detectives sat at the kitchen table talking, Bonnie and Jeff's son came into the house, and after he was told what happened to his father, he was absolutely devastated, but after composing himself, He told police that he might know who killed his father. He said just one night earlier, he had been watching TV with his dad when out of the blue, his dad, Jeff, turned to him and said, "If anything happens to me, Ed George did it." At the mention of this name, Ed George, the detectives' ears perked straight up because they knew who Ed George was. In fact, pretty much anyone who lived in Akron, Ohio knew who Ed George was. Ed was one of the wealthiest men in Akron, and he owned one of the city's most popular institutions, a place called Tangier. Tangier was part restaurant, part nightclub, and part banquet hall. And over the years, it had played host to major celebrities and personalities, ranging from the Beach Boys to Tina Turner to President George H.W. Bush, and years later, his son, President George W. Bush. There had always been rumors that some of Ed's wealth might be tied to organized crime, but those rumors had never been substantiated. And as far as anyone could tell, Ed was an upstanding citizen. He was an active member of the Catholic Church and a devoted father of 7 kids. So why had Jeff told his son that Ed might hurt him someday? After talking for a while with the son and with Bonnie, the detectives left for the night. The next morning, when the detectives went into the station, they told their colleagues about what Jeff had told his son about Ed George. And in that moment, one of the detectives, a guy named Paul Callahan, suddenly remembered a strange interaction he'd had with Ed about 6 months back. Paul had known Ed for years. Paul was in an Irish folk band that used to play at Ed's restaurant, Tangier, every St. Patrick's Day, so it wasn't weird for Paul to get a social call from Ed every once in a while. But 6 months ago, when Ed called Paul on his office line at the police station, it was not for a social call. On this call, Ed told Paul that some guy had been harassing his wife, Cindy. Paul asked Ed if he knew who this guy was, and Ed said yes. Paul said, "Okay, who is it?" But Ed said he didn't want to tell Paul. He also said he didn't want to file a police report. At first, Paul was confused by this, but he sensed that maybe Ed was just looking for some advice on how to handle the situation on his own. So Paul told Ed to just go confront the guy and tell him to leave Cindy alone. Ed said, "Okay, thank you," and then they both hung up. Now, normally, Paul might have just forgotten about a call like this. Except, this was not the only time Ed called Paul about this guy who was harassing his wife. In fact, just 2 weeks earlier, so roughly 5 months after this first call Paul got from Ed, and only 2 weeks before Jeff's murder, Ed called Paul again to say this guy was still harassing Cindy. After Paul finished telling his colleagues about these strange calls he got from Ed, the whole police department quickly began to wonder if maybe the guy who was harassing Ed's wife was actually Jeff, and maybe Ed did confront Jeff about it, and in the process of this confrontation, Ed killed Jeff. Regardless, the police knew they needed to figure out why Jeff had told his son that he thought Ed was going to hurt him. And who better to ask than Ed himself? So the next day, a team of 4 detectives drove out to Ed George's house, located 20 miles outside of Akron. The house was actually more like a compound. It sat on 18 acres of land and was made up of 2 big buildings. There was the main house, which was a whopping 8,000 square feet, and then there was the second house, which was a separate 4-bedroom home just for Ed and Cindy's servants. The detectives had all heard about how big Ed's property was, but when they turned off the main road and began driving up Ed's long driveway, they were all stunned by the sheer size of everything. The detectives reached the end of the driveway and parked right near the front steps of the main house. Then they climbed out of their vehicle and walked up to the front door and they knocked. A moment later, they heard shuffling feet coming from inside the house. Then the door slowly opened and the detectives were met with one of the George family's nannies. After the nanny said a quick hello, she asked the detectives what they were doing there. And when they explained the situation, the nanny said that Ed was actually not home at the moment. He was out golfing and wouldn't be back for a while. But she said Ed's wife, Cindy, was home if they wanted to talk to her. The detectives tried to act casual. They said, okay, yeah, sure, we'll talk to Cindy. But secretly, the detectives were actually thrilled about the prospect of talking to Ed's wife without Ed around to supervise. The detectives knew Cindy from Tangier. She often acted as the hostess. She was warm and charismatic, and she was also extremely beautiful. In fact, just 1 year earlier, Cindy had placed third in the Mrs. Ohio America pageant. But when 47-year-old Cindy emerged from her wing of the house, she looked extremely frail and broken down. The mother of 7 smiled a weak smile and then invited the detectives to join her in one of the family's large sitting rooms. Once they were all settled in, detectives explained that they were there to ask some questions about the death of Jeff Zach. Cindy was nervous, but she told them she would do her best to answer all of their questions. When asked what her husband, Ed, had been doing on the morning that Jeff was murdered, she said he had spent the entire morning at Tangier dealing with a drainage issue. As for her own whereabouts that morning, Cindy said that she was at home with her 7 kids getting everybody ready to go to a friend's wedding that was being held later that afternoon. When the detectives eventually shifted the conversation and asked Cindy directly if Jeff had been the person who was harassing her, Cindy seemed taken aback that they knew about that, but after taking a breath, she looked down and said, yes, he was. Cindy said that Jeff had actually been a friend of the family for many years, but at some point earlier that year, he just started calling the house incessantly, asking to talk to Cindy. When asked, Cindy said she did not know why Jeff was calling so much or what he wanted to talk to her about, but she didn't say it confidently, and as she said this, she looked kind of troubled. To the detectives, it seemed like Cindy might be hiding something about Jeff, but she also seemed totally scared about it, so the detectives very gently followed up with another similar question to try to figure out what Cindy knew. They said, well, even if you don't know why he was calling you, could you maybe just take a guess as to what he wanted? Cindy looked down at her hands as if the answer to this question was written somewhere on them, and then, after a long pause, she looked back up at the detectives and shook her head before telling them again she just didn't know. The detectives felt confident that Cindy did know more about Jeff than she was letting on, but they got the feeling that she was not going to open up much more that day. So they very politely wrapped up the conversation, thanked Cindy for her time, and then they made their way back outside to their car and headed back to the station. The next morning, Paul called his old friend Ed and asked him if he wouldn't mind coming into the station so they could ask him some questions about Jeff Zach's murder. Ed responded by saying, of course, me and Cindy will be there soon. But neither Ed nor Cindy would come down to the police station that day. Instead, about an hour after that phone call with Paul, Ed's lawyer showed up at the police station and walked straight up to Paul's desk and informed the detective that his client, Ed George, would not be participating in this investigation. The lawyer then turned around and left. Paul was stunned. He felt like if Ed was innocent, he never would have sent his lawyer in like that. But without evidence tying Ed to Jeff's murder, there was really nothing the police could do. Over the next few weeks, the police tried calling Ed and Cindy's friends and relatives in the hopes that someone would be willing to shed some light on what happened between Ed and Cindy and Jeff. But one after another, Ed's friends and family all declined to speak with law enforcement and just told the detectives to speak with their lawyers instead. And these lawyers, the detectives would discover, were all being paid for by Ed. But again, despite how guilty Ed looked, without evidence, there was really nothing police could do about Ed or how he was conducting himself. So the detectives had to go back to the drawing board. They spent days reviewing the crime scene photos and reading witness statements and playing Bonnie's voicemail tape over and over again, but none of that got them anywhere. And then, one day, the detectives realized they'd missed something. The detectives were sitting around at a conference table talking in circles about the case when one of the detectives picked up a photo of the George family, and this detective immediately noticed something. In this photo were Ed and Cindy and their 7 kids. 2 of their kids were adopted, and so of course they looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. But as this detective stared at this photo, they noticed that 4 of the 5 biological children looked exactly like Ed and Cindy. But the 5th biological child, the youngest, the 8-year-old, looked nothing like Ed or Cindy. Instead, this youngest child looked just like the murder victim, Jeff Zack. The detective who noticed this turned the photo around to show her colleagues, and after looking it over, they all agreed. And if this 8-year-old child was indeed Jeff's child, not Ed's, then the child was clear evidence of an affair happening between Cindy and Jeff, which would give Jeff a reason for wanting to call Cindy all the time, and it would give Ed a motive for wanting to kill Jeff. When the detectives brought this theory to the county prosecutor's office, they agreed there was enough evidence to get a warrant that would force the Georges to take a paternity test. So that's what they did. The warrant was issued, and on August 24th, 2001, a little more than 2 months after Jeff's murder, Ed and Cindy, along with the 8-year-old youngest child, arrived in a doctor's office to take a court-ordered DNA test. And sure enough, when the results came back 3 weeks later, it would show that Jeff was the father of this child, not Ed. The George family was notified by phone, so the detectives didn't get to see how Ed or Cindy reacted to the news, but when the results of this paternity test made it to the local press, people were absolutely shocked. Ed and Cindy were like local celebrities, and they seemed like the perfect couple. So this news about Cindy's affair quickly swept through the city, and soon locals would begin openly speculating about the possibility that Ed had hired a hitman to murder his wife's lover, Jeff. And it wasn't just the locals who thought this was what happened. The police also suspected that this was a professional hit. And so they began scouring Ed's phone records, his bank statements, and questioned every Tangier employee willing to speak to them in order to find the evidence they needed that proved Jeff's murder was an assassination paid for by Ed. But after months of looking, they found nothing, and so it was starting to look like this case was going to go cold. However, about 1 year after the murder, a new tip would come into the station that would lead the detectives in a roundabout way to the home of a 40-year-old single mother named Christine Todero, and she would break the case wide open. Christine seemed to have no apparent connection to the case, but she believed that her ex-husband was the masked motorcycle-riding hitman, the man who killed Jeff Zack. And the reason she believed this was because one time, when she was speaking on the phone with her ex, he made this joke about him being the killer. But Christine suspected he was not actually joking, because during her brief marriage to him, 35-year-old John Zaffino had been violent and dangerous. In fact, Christine left him because he punched her 13-year-old son in the face and, in a separate incident, broke Christine's arm intentionally. When Christine listened to the mysterious voicemail that Jeff's wife Bonnie had shown police, where some guy was demanding to speak to Jeff, Christine's eyes shot wide open, and she said, "Yes, 100%, that is my ex-husband, John." After that, detectives would run a search on any and all vehicles registered in John's name, and by noon, they had a full report in their hands. Everybody at the station got a copy of this report, and together, the detectives reviewed it line by line, scanning for anything that could tie John to Jeff's murder. And within minutes, the detectives found what they were looking for. According to the report, in May of 2001, less than 1 month before Jeff's murder, John had purchased a motorcycle from a dealership outside of Akron. And when police called that dealership, the manager told them that the bike John had purchased was a black ninja-style bike with a green stripe, just like the one ridden by the person who killed Jeff. Detectives would also discover that in that same month, John had also purchased a weapon, a .38 caliber handgun, the same kind of gun that killed Jeff. But while John certainly looked like the prime murder suspect, there were still 2 questions the detectives were struggling to answer. The first was, why would John do this? There was no connection between him and Jeff whatsoever. So was he just a hitman, potentially hired by Ed? Nobody knew. The second question was, how could John afford the very expensive motorcycle and gun? The police had done a lot of digging on John, and they knew he did not have very much money. In fact, John was so deep in debt, he couldn't even afford his own apartment. The police would spend months searching for the answers to these two general questions, and by the time John was arrested in September of 2002, detectives would be convinced that both of these questions actually had the same answer, and that answer was Sparky. Sparky was the nickname John had given to a woman he met one night in the summer of 2000, about a year before Jeff's murder. That summer, John was standing outside of a restaurant in Akron when he saw this woman, Sparky, walking toward her car. She was beautiful, she was alone, and to John, she looked really sad. So John walked up to her and started a conversation. And quickly, in this conversation, Sparky would tell John that she was married, to which he said he didn't care because he was married too, to Christine. John reached into his pocket and pulled out an old gum wrapper and then wrote his phone number on it, and then he handed the paper to Sparky and asked her to please call him that night after she got home so he would know she arrived safely. Sparky would indeed call John later that night when she got home, and they would chat for a while, nothing more. But not long after this first interaction, Sparky began sneaking off from her husband to go meet up with John. Now, at the time, John did not have a steady source of income or an apartment of his own. So, not long after they met, Sparky moved John into an apartment that she paid for where they could spend the nights alone together. She also paid all of John's other bills and bought him a cell phone so she could reach him whenever she wanted. It was an extremely passionate love affair, but they both talked openly about the future and how maybe there was some way for them to be together long term. However, Sparky made it very clear that no matter what, she would never, ever leave her husband. Before she married her husband, she had nothing. She was a poor coal miner's daughter living in a 200-square-foot house with 3 other people. But now, through her husband, she had a home and she had some nice things, and so she was not prepared to give any of that up. However, things in Sparky's married life were far from perfect, as John would find out one night in January of 2001, roughly 6 months after meeting Sparky. That January night, Sparky called John hysterically crying. She told him that an ex-boyfriend of hers was giving her serious problems. It would turn out John was not the first man Sparky had had an affair with. It would also turn out that this other guy was not technically Sparky's ex-boyfriend, at least not yet. Sparky had been seeing this other guy for nearly a decade, and she had tried to break it off with him many times in the past, but each time, he always figured out a way to rope her back in. But now that Sparky was with John, she finally had the courage to tell this other guy that it was really over. And so she had told him that she did not want to see him again or have any contact with him whatsoever. And this made the now ex-boyfriend absolutely furious. He started threatening to hurt Sparky and her children, and he threatened to expose their secret relationship to the public. Sparky was terrified and didn't know what to do. John's reaction to all of this was not being upset with Sparky for seeing another man. Instead, John's reaction was fear. He was scared that if this ex-boyfriend exposed Sparky, then Sparky's husband would divorce her, and suddenly Sparky wouldn't have all that money that she got from her husband, and so Sparky would not be able to pay for John's life. Because remember, Sparky is paying for John's apartment, she's paying all his bills, she's paying for everything. And so John couldn't have that happen. He needed to make sure Sparky and her husband stayed married for his sake. And so naturally, a plan was made to murder Sparky's very troublesome ex-boyfriend, whose real name was Jeff Zack. No one knows for sure if Sparky or John initiated this murder plan, but what investigators do know is that in May of 2001, about 1 month before Jeff Zack was murdered, Sparky withdrew $5,300 from her bank account. And then 3 hours later, John used that same amount of money to buy the black Ninja-style bike with the green stripe. Also that same month, John purchased a handgun from one of his colleagues at the trucking company where he worked. A couple weeks after that, John quit his job at the trucking company because, as John told one of his colleagues, his girlfriend was going to be, quote, setting him up in business. 1 week later, on Saturday, June 17th, 2001, the day before Father's Day, John suited up in full-body leather and put on a full-faced motorcycle helmet over his head. Then he rode his brand new motorcycle to BJ's Wholesale to wait for Jeff. John knew that Jeff would most likely swing by BJ's at some point that day because usually on Saturdays, Jeff would go to BJ's to buy candy to restock his vending machines. And so, at 11:49 a.m., Sparky, aka Cindy George, mother of 7, called her lover and hitman, John, on the cell phone she had bought for him. The pair talked on the phone while John rode in circles on his motorcycle around the BJ's parking lot, hoping, praying that Jeff would show up. That call would end at 11:56, just as John spotted Jeff pulling into the parking lot in his Ford Explorer. As Jeff pulled up to one of the gas pumps, John pulled up right behind him. Then, after Jeff had fueled his vehicle and gotten back inside, John got off his motorcycle, pulled the handgun out of his saddlebag, and then walked right up to Jeff's driver's side window, aimed his gun, and fired a single shot directly into Jeff's face. In the confusion that followed, John managed to hop back on his motorcycle and ride quickly away from the scene without being followed. About 20 minutes later, when he'd reached a safe distance from the crime scene, he called Cindy again. We don't know exactly what was said on that call, but it's assumed that on this call, John told Cindy that he had just killed Jeff and that she no longer had to worry about her marriage to Ed falling apart. But, of course, whatever peace that murder brought for Cindy and John was short-lived. Because in June of 2003, almost exactly 2 years after Jeff was murdered, John was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Cindy would be arrested a year and a half after John went to jail, and then 11 months after her arrest, Cindy would be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison as well. However, Cindy's conviction would not stand. Less than 2 years after being sentenced, her conviction was overturned on appeal. The justices ruled that the evidence presented in her trial was insufficient to prove her guilt. And so, on March 22, 2007, almost 6 years after the murder of Jeff Zack, Cindy George was released from prison. And waiting for her outside the prison walls were her 7 kids and her husband, Ed. After a long, tearful embrace, the family hopped into a car and took Cindy back to their giant estate outside of Akron, where she and her family still live today.
The mortar and pestle humming low, chasing the formula where perfection will grow. I poured my days into lead and into steel, trying to turn what's mundane into some.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, repeatedly text the Amazon Music follow button saying that they need to call you immediately, but when they do, dismissively tell them you can't talk right now. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballin Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors